Right, with Hashem's help, we will learn today Yevamos Daf Nun Aleph. We left off yesterday Daf Nun Amud Beis all the way in the bottom of the page, last two words, Amar Rava. In our Mishnah, we had a machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim, beginning with if ein get achar get or if yesh get achar get. Rabbi Gamliel said, for example, in a case where one brother died with two wives, with two widows, two Yevamos, and there's one brother who has the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Mishnah spoke out the case that if this living brother, if the Yavam gave a get to both the first Yevama and to the second Yevama, being that midirabanan, as we will see later, a get has some type of effect. Therefore, from now on, at least midirabanan, this Yavam will not be allowed to marry either one of the wives because of the concept of kiven shaloi bana shuv lo yivne. And there's consequences of what happens with a Yavam vis-a-vis if he doesn't marry his Yevama because he gave her a chalitza, then he will not be allowed to marry her relatives. And midrabanan, the same halacha refers also to the concept of a get. That if he gave a get to one of his Yevamos, that will affect that he will no longer be allowed to marry her relatives. So Rabbi Gamliel said that if the Yavam gave a get to one Yevama and then to another Yevama, so the get that he gave to the second Yevama is of no consequence, and therefore, for example, after he gives chalitza, if he'll give chalitza to the first Yevama, he will be allowed to marry the relatives of the second. Now, initially, the way we can understand the opinion of Rabbi Gamliel is that Rabbi Gamliel holds that a get is so effective it completely dissolves the zika, which is why he says, since you already gave a get to the first Yevama and there is no more zika, therefore there's no get or there's no validity to the get he gave to the second Yevama. This is the way Tosfos explains what would have been the initial understanding, which is rejected by Rava. Because if that would have been the case, then Rabbi Gamliel also would have held that once he gave a get to one Yevama, if he then gives maimer to the second Yevama, that maimer is of no consequence. However, the Mishnah immediately said that even Rabbi Gamliel, who holds ein get achar get, will hold that yesh maimer achar get. And the consequences of the maimer with the second Yevama will have halachic significance. So therefore it must be that the get ein get achar get is not because one get is very effective, but let's read it inside. My tamad Rab Gamliel, because the mesapker lay, because Rab Gamliel says that there is a genuine doubt if a get idachi, iloi dachi, if a get mida oiraisa will fully sever, dissolve the zika or not. Likewise, when Rab Gamliel said his same din of ein maimer achar maimer, it's all because of the same logic that Rab Gamliel has a doubt if maimer kani, if maimer acquires, finalizes the zika with that yevama, oiloi kani, or if it does not acquire the yevama for him as a wife. And now he talks it out. Get idachi iloi dachi. So therefore we say the following: Miman of Shech. The reason why the second get that he gave to the second Yevama is of no consequence, because ikama dachi, because if the first one fully dissolved the zika, so now there is no more zika, is basra mai ka'ave, the second one was not needed. It meant nothing, and therefore it should not and does not have any consequence, halachic consequence. However, ikama leidachi, but if a get doesn't do anything, because mida oiraisa, the only way that we can either finalize, marry, or dissolve the zika is either through yibum or through chalitza. Get is not one of the options. So if the kama leidachi, if a get is of no consequence, so then the second one for sure is of no consequence. Is basra nami leidachi. And likewise, that's the same reason why Rab Gamliel holds that ein maimer achar maimer, because he had a doubt, maimer ikani iloi kani. If maimer affects an acquisition, at least on one level or on some level, or if it doesn't do anything. Ikama kani, if the first maimer affected the acquisition, so the yavam is now married, so to say, to one yavama, and once you're married to one yavama, the zika with the other one is dissolved. So basra maika of it. So the maimer he gave to the second yavama is of no consequence. And v'ikama loikani, because maimer perhaps doesn't do anything when it comes to a situation of a Yavam and a Yevama, is Basranami Lekani. So therefore the second one will also have no consequence. So Miman of Shech, the second get, La'achar get, or the second Maimer, La'achar Maimer, will have no consequence. That is the way Rava explains Rab Gamliel, to which Eisvei Abaya asks him that we learned in a Braisa, Umayde Rab Gamliel agrees that there is a get after Maimer. In other words, if he gave a Maimer to the first Yevama, the next normal step would be to do Yibum with her. But instead of doing Yibum with her, he gave a get to the second Yevama. And Rab Gamliel holds that that get will have a consequence, that the Yavam will no longer be allowed to marry later her relatives, or reverse, a Maimer works after a get. And here the Braisa adds a case that we didn't have in our Mishnah. And Rab Gamliel says that a get will have some consequence if it's given after Maimer and after Bia. So the case that here is referring to is if when one Yavam has three Yevamos. So Reuven had three wives, and Reuven died childless. So there's the zikah between Shimon and all of the three. And here he went ahead with the first one, and he did Maimer with the first one. Then he goes to the second Yevama, and he has a relation with her, Bia. And then with the third one, he gives a get. Or if it was Maimer after Bia uget, if the order here was get, Bia, and Maimer, so Rab Gamliel holds that the final act that he did, either the get or in the second case the final Maimer, will have some consequence. And now, says the Gemara, says Abaye to Rava, according to your understanding of Rab Gamliel, this latter part of the Braisa should not work. Because when it comes to the effectiveness of a get, the way you would have explained that he has a doubt if it is effective or not, so then mimanavshach in both cases, the second act that he did with the second Yevama, which was he had the Bia with her, to have a Bia, the lechatchila and v'tiknei. We learned in the Mishnah that if the first thing the Yavam does with either of the Yevamas is he has a relation with her, there is Bia. Bia is the Oraisa Diki Yibum. The Yibum affects the full marriage between the Yavam and that Yevama. So then, for sure, whatever the Yavam might do to the other widow will have no consequence because it is meaningless because he's already married to the first Yevama. That is the din if he does Bia lechatchila. We did learn in our Mishnah, not the opinion of Rab Nechemia, but the opinion of the Tanakama, that if something was done before Bia, it becomes a Bia Psula, as we explained in the previous year. A Bia Psula will not affect a full marriage. Some Zika will still remain. And then, if the Yavam does another act with another Yevama, that final act will have some halachic significance. However, let's work through this case. If the Yavam goes to the first Yevama and gives her Maimer, so we're saying that according to Rab Gamliel, there's a doubt. Either Maimer fully acquires her, just like Yibum does, just like Bia does, maybe Maimer does, and then, or maybe not. Then he goes to the second Yevama and he has Bia with her. So let's say the same Iman of Shech. If Maimer did nothing, so then the Bia that he had with the second Yevama was a full-fledged, correct Yibum. And if that would be the case, now that he's fully married to the second Yevama, the get that he gives to the third should have no significance. And likewise in the second case, if he gives a get to the first Yevama. So if the get is of significance, he's married to the first one. And then the Bia he had with the second one is of no meaning, of no validity. And if the get he gave to the first one is nothing, so then the Bia that he had with the second one is a full-fledged Yibum. And it's considered the first thing that he did. But whichever one it will be, the final act that he did with the third Yevama should be nothing. The Hatanan Habi'ila, we learned in our Mishnah, that if Bia, Bizman Shehi Batchila, if it was done as the first thing, so then Ein Achrei Klum, then nothing that happens afterwards should have a significance. And if the Bia is not valid because the get is valid, so again, if the get is valid, so then the third act, the third Maimer should mean nothing. Or in the first case, if the Maimer is valid, then again, the Bia that he did at the end, the get that he gave at the end is also of no significance. So Ella, therefore, Rava tells that Lo'olam Pshita le Rab Gamliel. It's not that Rab Gamliel has a doubt, but Rab Gamliel knows for sure, beget, the dachi, the way most Rishonim learn that midrabanan, a get affects a partial severance of the zikah. It partially rejects her, Same thing when a person does maimer midrabanan dikani, that the maimer does a partial acquisition. And therefore, he explains the mission the following: Miyu amay rabbanan. This is the way the rabbis applied this law. That hayavama, when it comes to this case of yibum, bechad sad mahani boget, that to a certain degree, as we said, the get severs the relationship. Likewise, ubechad sad, to a certain degree, mahani b'maimer. And therefore, if he gave a get to the first one, and then he gives a get to the second Yevama, whatever get could affect, it fully affected, and it doesn't leave room for a second get to add anything to it. Get achar get loidachi. The reason why Rabbi Gamliel says that the second get he gave to the second Yevama will not have a consequence, because he already gave a get to the first Yevama, the hadachi lakama, and that first get affected a partial, full-fledged separation, dissolved the zika. Maimer achar maimer, likewise, if he did maimer to one, then there's no more room for maimer to acquire the second one, because the loi cunning. Why will the second mimer not acquire? Because whatever a mimer could acquire, it already acquired with the first yivama, the hakani lekama. However, if he gave a get to one, and then he gave a mimer to the other, or vice versa, get acha mimer or mimer acha get, being that each one does something else, one acquires, one dissolves. So here, what the get affected in one is not happening at all to the second. Hai milsa kadachi, v'hai milsa kalkani. And therefore, each one could do what it is being used for the first time. That is how he explains Rab Gamliel. However, the Rabbanon hold that even when it comes to a get la'achar get, the Chachamim say yesh get achar get, and the halacha is, for example, that goes into effect when a get is given to a yevama, will go into effect when he gave the get to the second yevama. Kol chad v'chati kino le Rabbanon get to maimer b'yevama. Mid the Rabbanon, the rabbi said that a get or a maimer could have a certain effect, and it has that effect in every case that it is given, to every yivama to whom it's given to. Likewise, in the other example that we can learn in the Mishnah, when there are two brothers and each one gives the same woman a get, or each brother gives the same woman a maimer. However, let's go back to Rab Gamliel. Why did Rab Gamliel say that when there were three Yevamis, and either the order was maimer to one, bia to the second, and get to the third, so Rab Gamliel says that the third get does have a consequence. Likewise, get, bia, and maimer, the finer maimer has a consequence. Because v'hai bia psula, because whatever he did in with the second Yevama, which was bia, either bia after get, or bia after maimer, in both cases, that bia was a disqualified bia, as we explained. Why was it disqualified? If a man gives a woman a get, midrabanan, we apply this lav of kiven shalei bana shuv le'yivna. So he's not allowed to have marriage to any of the Yevamis. So when he had bia to the second one, it wasn't a good bia. It wasn't a proper bia. True, the bia affected enough of a connection, midayraisa, that he'll have to give her a get, emes, but he won't be allowed to stay with her. So being that the bia was a bia psula, so then if he did something after the bia to a third woman, which was he gave the third woman maimer, the maimer also has some type of effect. And he's saying that bia psula on one hand is stronger than a maimer, and on the other hand is weaker than maimer. Adifa mi maimer, a disqualified bia is stronger than a maimer. Why? Because the ilu maimer achar maimer, loy mahani, according to Rab Gamliel, like we explained, once maimer is given to one woman, according to Abaya, it affects a partial acquisition. If he'll give maimer to the other yevama, it won't have any effect. However, v'ilu bia achar maimer, if he does maimer to one, and then he had bia with the other, then mahani, the bia will have some type of effect. Now, of course, you cannot do yibum with both yevamis, and he'll have to divorce both of them, because one disqualifies the other, but on the other hand, the bia had some type of effect. But on the other hand, v'greya mi maimer, a bia psula is weaker than maimer, the ilu maimer achar get kani. If there were three yevamis, to the first one he gave a get, and then to the second one he gives maimer, and then to the third one he does maimer. So there Rab Gamliel will hold that what he did with the third will not be effective. Ein maimer achar maimer. The kulish yure di get, ilu maimer achar get kanei lekule sheyure di get. So whatever the get whatever the get did a partial acquisition, it still allows a mimer to happen with the second Yevama, but only with the second and not with the third. However, he says, what's going to happen? Like we said, mimer and bia and get, so then this get will have an effect. There was enough zika left for the get to be significant, which is why he said in both cases that the final act will also have some type of effect. So here we have the machlokes between Abaye and Rava, how to explain the opinion of Rabbi Gamliel. Tan Rabbanan, the Gemara is going to quote a brisa which will explain in more detail how do we apply the cases of get achar get, maimer achar maimer, or maimer achar get and get achar maimer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'akol v'dvarim. That nun aleph in the middle of the Amid. Keitzad Amar Rabbi Gamliel ein get achar get. What will be an example of a case where Rabbi Gamliel rules that the second get does not have any effect halachically? That if you had shtei yevamos, if there were two widows, shenaflu lifnei yavam echad, that fall before one brother, one yavam, and the nasan get lezu, he gave to the first yevama a get, and then he gave to the second yevama a get. So, first of all, marriage he can no longer have, because since he gave a get, as we explained, either a buyer or Rava, either it could have, or it for sure has some type of severance consequence. And once he severed the zika, yibum is no longer an option. So therefore, what needs to happen here? Chalitza. Says Rab Gamliel that chaylitz lo rishayna, that chalitza he should give to the first yevama, to the one to whom he gave the get first, as we'll see later, the Gemara will explain that really chalitza he could have given to either of them, but we're teaching us a good advice, a eitzah tova, being that the second get does not have any consequence, which means he'll be allowed to marry the relatives of the second yevama. If he's going to give the chalitza with the second yevama, then you're not allowed to marry kroivas chalutzasei. So in order for him to keep those relatives that are anyways prohibited, why don't you add their chalitza? That makes a lot more sense than giving chalitza to the second one, and then he'll be both prohibited to marry the kroivas of girushasei from the first, and also he will be prohibited to marry the relatives of the second. And v'asar b'kroivos secha, he will not be allowed to marry the relatives of the first yevama, because he gave her a get, and now because he gave her chalitza. However, umutar b'kroivos shenia, because ein get la'achar get. That's Rab Gamliel. V'chachamim oimrim that nasan get lezu, if he gave a get to the first one and then the get lezu and a get to the second one, both gittin had some type of effect, and therefore v'asur b'kroivos shteim, he won't be allowed to marry later the relatives of either of these yevamos. Marriage cannot happen with neither of them because he gave a get, and therefore chalitza has to be given. Here the Chachamim agree to Rab Gamliel unanimously that only one chalitza is needed. However, to which one? To anyone you want, because anyways the relatives of both of them are asur to the yavam. And v'chalitza la'achas mehem. And now the Baraisa adds v'chein ato omer, and the same exact halacha will be when there will be two brothers and one yevama. Same exact scenario. So Reuven only had one wife, Rachel, but he had both Shimon and Levi living brothers. Same thing, if Shimon gave a get to Rachel, and then Levi gave a get to Rachel, or if Shimon gave Maimer to Rachel, and then Levi gave Maimer to Rachel, Machlekes Rab Gamliel and the Chachamim, whether the second get or the second Maimer will have any effect. Now, Keitzad Amar Rab Gamliel. Oh, let's talk out the case of ein maimer achar maimer. The same thing. Let's go back to the case where there were two wives, two widows now, and one living brother. Shtei yevamos shenaflu lifnei yavam echad. V'asar maimer bezu, this living brother gave maimer to one widow, which was perfect, which was the pre-yibum step. Everything would have been fine. But then he went ahead and he gave maimer to the other yevama. Now, the moment he gave maimer to both yevamas, he will no longer be allowed to marry either of them, because each one is, so to say, the sister of his wife. Because maimer affects either a doubtful or it affects some type of acquisition. Therefore, a get will have to be given. The only question is to whom. Rab Gamliel says, Noisin get lo rishayna, that he has to give a get to the first one. The Gemara is going to ask later, according to Rab Gamliel, if he holds that ein maimer la'achar maimer. If the second maimer had no halachic consequence, so if it had no halachic consequence, so then the first yevama to whom he gave the first mimer, she is his almost or quasi-wife. He's not married to her sister at all, because ein mimer achar mimer, so why can't he do yibum? The Gemara is going to ask that later. But Rabbi Gamliel is also going to hold that he's going to have to give her a get, to the first one. And not only does he have to give her a get, but again, chalitza will be needed. And with which one? Vaited, with the first one, chalitz law. And he's going to be usher from now on to marry her relatives. However, even though he gave mimer to the second Yevama, he'll be allowed to marry her relatives, because the second mimer was nothing. Ein mimer la'achar mimer. However, the chachamim mimerim noisin get l'shteim, that being that he gave a mimer to both, yesh mimer achar mimer, and va'asur b'krei v'shteim, will be prohibited to marry the relatives of both of these Yevamas. Chalitza will have to be given, and like always, only one chalitza is needed. V'chalitza la'achs mehem. And again, the Braisa says, v'chein ato omer, and the same thing will be when there's going to be two brothers and one widow. B'shnei Yevam v'Yevam achas. And that's the end of the Braisa. So Amar Mar, now the Gemara is going to analyze this Braisa. First case was that if Noisen get lazu, the get lazu, Rab Gamliel says, you do chalitza with the first one, and v'asur b'krei v'yiseha. However, you'll be allowed, according to Rab Gamliel, to marry the relatives of the second Yevama. Ask the Gemara, why should one chalitza be enough? This l'chayda will refute the din that was taught from Shmuel. Leimet to have it to you to the Shmuel. Because Shmuel says that whenever there was something called a chalitza psula, that's the dinim that we are learning in our Mishnah, chalitza psula, bia psula. In other words, when chalitza is a deficient chalitza, one of the reasons why a chalitza will be deficient is when a person is giving chalitza to a Yevama with whom he is not allowed to do yibum. A proper chalitza is when there's a real option. You can either do yibum or do chalitza. And you choose to do chalitza, so then the chalitza severs the zika. However, in a case, like in our case, when yibum is no longer an option, why? Because he gave a get. So even though chalitza is needed, it's called a disqualified chalitza. And Shmuel says, then one chalitza is not enough, but you have to do chalitza with all of the Yevamos. That Shmuel says, chalatz labalas get, if a man gives his Yevama a get, and now he has to give her chalitza, and he gives her chalitza, still loy niftarat tzara. If there was another Yevama, he has to do chalitza with her as well. Yibum was not an option there, but chalitza is needed with everyone. Here, Rab Gamliel says one chalitza is enough. Answers the Gemara, Amar lach Shmuel. Shmuel will tell you, don't refute me from our Mishnah, from the Tana Rab Gamliel. Ki amri anna. Why did I say that the chalitza is possible and a get is needed from all of the sisters, from all of the wives? Laman da Amar, that's only according to the opinions that hold, like we learned extensively in the previous sugyas, yesh zika. That when the husband dies, there's an automatic connection between the Yavam and all of the Yavamas. Being that the get severed that connection, it only severed that connection a little bit, not fully, because chalitza still needed. But it severed it between the Yavam and that Yavama, the recipient of the get. So that zika is weaker. The zika with the other sisters are stronger, which is why the chalitza with one is called a disqualified, because it's cutting off something that to begin with wasn't that strong, and according to Shmuel, it will not work to cut off the zika with another with whom the zika is stronger. But that's all because of the yesh zika. And Shmuel knows that Rab Gamliel holds ein zika. I'll speak out a case in a second from where we see that the Gamliel holds ein zika. And being that ein zika, the get that he gave to the first didn't sever the zika. So they're both Yevamos, both co-wives are equally, so to say, commanded either to do yibum or chalitza with the yavam, but one is not better or weaker than the other. So Rab Gamliel will say that one will be enough. Now, from where do we know that Rab Gamliel holds that ein zika? So the case is where there were two brothers who were married to two sisters. Let's say Reuven was married to Rachel. Reuven and Rachel were adults, and Shimon married Leah in a case where the marriage that he had with Leah was only a rabbinic marriage. For example, Leah was an orphan, and her mother married her off, and she's still a minor. She's not yet bas mitzvah. So there we spoke about the case. What happens now if Reuven dies, leaving his wife Rachel a widow, falling to Yibum to Shimon. Now if Shimon would have been married mid'oraisa to Leah, Rachel would have been an erva to Shimon achais ishtoi, then there would be automatically no din, no obligation, not of yibum nor of chalitza, nor would it be permitted. But being that the marriage he has with Leah is only a rabbinic marriage, so therefore the chachamim over there hold that he's not allowed to be with his wife. Why not? Because being that midaraisa he's not married to his wife, and now that Reuven died, there is a zika that he has with Rachel, with the widow. Leah now becomes achois zikukasei. A man cannot be with a sister, with a woman with whom he has a zika. Rab Gamliel argues with the chachamim, and he holds that if Shimon wants, he can remain married to Leah. And if she will not refuse the marriage until she is bas mitzvah, and she stays married to Shimon, then she will become his mido ayraisa dik, a full-fledged wife. And now Rachel will automatically be permitted to marry to whomever she wants, because the zika will automatically fall off, because she's an erva, because she's the sister of his wife. She's achais ishtoi, Leah being the wife. Now the fact that Rab Gamliel allows him to stay married to Leah proves she's l'chayra achayz zikukasei, because Rab Gamliel doesn't hold that there is zika. So Leah is not achayz, there is no zika. Now the Gemara says, and this statement is a presumption that Omi that Rab Gamliel savar ein zika, being that now we just said that Rab Gamliel, as we know from this din of the two brothers and two sisters, holds ein zika. And we are also having the din over here of ein get la'achar get, turning the page. So now the Gemara is making a presumption that Rabbanan, the Chachamim who hold yesh get la'achar get, yesh maimer achar maimer, perhaps hold yesh zika. And look, top Rashi, in the middle of the line, Kostalka daitach, that there's a havamina, that the chiheche, the pligi, Rabbanan, Gamliel, beget achar get, perhaps they also argue, they also disagree regarding the din of zika. The Rashi is pointing out that there is no proof from a din or from the way the Chachamim worded anything in our Mishnah which would indicate that they hold Yesh Zika. But we're saying that if they would hold Yesh Zika, so now let's look in the Sefer. What's the case of the Sefer? That if there were two brothers and one Yevama, and each brother gave that Yevama a get, so then Chachamim, that Rab Gamliel hold the second get is of no consequence, that second brother can marry her relatives, and the Chachamim hold that yesh get achar get. So now the Gemara says, if you hold the din of zikon, lema to have it to yufta, the Rabba bar Rav Huna Marav, because the Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna in the name of Rav, that whenever there is a chalitza that's psula, she has to get chalitza from all of the brothers. When there is more than one brother, if the chalitza is deficient, she needs chalitza from everyone. What do the Chachamim hold? Yesh get achar get. So the get has a consequence. But then the Chachamim say that she only needs to get chalitza from one, if the Chachamim hold that yesh zika, being that when he gave a get to both brothers gave her a get. And according to the Chachamim, and according to Rab Gamliel, she cannot do yibum with either of them. So chalitza was needed. So l'chayra she should need to get chalitza from both. Nevertheless, the Mishnah says she only needs to get chalitza from one. Kasha and Rabba Barafuna. So Amar Rabba Barafuna, he wants you to know that Bein L'Rav Gamliel, Bein L'Rabbanan, being that they in our Mishnah both said that even when you need to get a get from both, but you never need to get chalitza from more than one of the remaining Yevamos, they both must hold Ein Zika. And the only argument they have in the Mishnah is regarding but not regarding the din of Yesh Zika. They both hold Ein Zika, and you cannot refute from these Tanoim to the Amoraim who held that being that we say Yesh Zika, whenever there is a Chalitza Psula, you need to get Chalitza from every single brother. Continuing in the Gemara, Amar Mar. The Braisa continued that Asa Maimer Bezu, Umaimer Bezu. Let's go back to the first case that we had, that there were two Yevam Mois and one Yavam. So Shimon, the living brother, did Maimer both with Rachel and then with the other wife, with Miriam. Rab Gamliel says that you only have to give a get to the first one. A get has to be given to the first one. And then he says, V'choylitz ladu chalitza with her. And Shimon will forever be prohibited to marry her relatives. However, ein get la'achar get, the second get is of no significance, and therefore later Shimon will be allowed to marry her relatives of the second. Umutar b'krei v'sheniya. So ask the Gemara, Michti, behold, Kosava Rab Gamliel. Rab Gamliel is explicitly stating, Ein Maimer Acher Maimer. And if Ein Maimer Acher Maimer, then why can't he marry the first one? He gave Maimer to the first. The second Maimer was nothing. It's as if he didn't do it. So let him marry the first. Let him finalize the Maimer by doing Yibum with the first Yevama. Rishoyin Namitis Yabim, answers the Gemara, Gzeira. What's the Gzeira? Dilma Asi Liyabume Lishniya. True, theoretically, he should be allowed to do Yibum with her. But if the Chachamim would allow Yibum, being that he already interacted with both Yevamis, he gave Maimer to one, and then he gave Maimer to the other. If we're going to have in our heads that Yibum is permitted, he might think that he can do Yibum with the second. And with the second, for sure, he can't do Yibum. Because the Maimer affects something, or like Rava, perhaps affected something with the first Yevama and the Yavam. So the other one is Achais Ishtoi, or a maybe Achais Ishtoi. So since he can't do it to the second, they made a takana, a gezerah, not to do it with the first. Amar Rabbi Yechanan, says Rabbi Yechanan, that Rabbi Gamliel and Beis Shammai and Rabbi Shimon and Ben Azai and Rab Nechemia, Kulhu Sevira Lahu, they all hold that Maimer Koina, Kinyan Gomor, that Maimer has a very strong effect. I'm saying very strong because all of these Tanoim do not exactly share the same opinion that Maimer affects a full-fledged marriage. Let's read inside the Rashi. Kinyan Gomer loy Gomer mamish. Ella Kinyan Chashuv. Don't forget, if Maimer would do mamish a Kinyan Gomer, if Maimer would be like Yibum, then he's already married to her. For example, if Ein Maimer la'acher Maimer, but then maybe Chalitza should not be needed. A get should only be needed. So we see even in our Mishnah, Maimer doesn't do something Gomer, there's no Kinyan Gomer but a Kinyan Chashuv. At kedei kach, that Ein Maimer la'acher Maimer. So Rab Gamliel is the din that we said, Ein Maimer la'acher Maimer. What about Beis Shammai? From where do we see that Beis Shammai holds that Maimer is a Kinyan Chashuv? And Beis Shammai gives Maimer the greatest power more than any of the other Tanoim mentioned here. And the Tanan, from where do we see the opinion of Beis Shammai? We had this din before, where there were three brothers. Two of them were married to two sisters. So there was Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven married Rachel. Shimon married Rachel's sister Leah. And the third one, Levi, was still single. And Va'achas Mufna. Now, the case was that one of the brothers who were married to the sisters, let's say Reuven dies. Now, Shimon is not even connected to Rachel, because Shimon is married to Leah. Rachel is asar mitzad erva achos ishtay. So the only brother that could do anything here is Levi. Comes along Levi, and Levi doesn't do Yibum yet. Levi does Maimer. For asar ba mufna, Levi does Maimer with Rachel. Now, now Shimon dies. So what does Beis Shammai say? What's the challenge over here? If Maimer does not affect the Kinyan Gomer, we have two sisters that are falling to Yibum to one brother, to a Yavam. He cannot marry either of them, according to the Chachamim, according to Beis Hillel, because each one is called Achai Zikul Kasei, because he's connected to both, and each one is a sister to the other. However, being that Beis Shammai gives more koyach, gives more validity to Maimer, being that Levi did Maimer with Rachel, to a certain degree he's married to Rachel. And if he's married to Rachel, then Leah doesn't fall to Yibum to him, because she is Achais Ishtay. And therefore Beis Shammai says, Ishtay Imai, that he can stay married, he can continue the marriage that he started with Rachel. And not only that, no chalitza is even needed with Leah, with Shimon's wife. Again, we see that she's not called Achai Zikul Kasei because he holds that Maimer has a effect. And he's from, as we said, he gives Maimer the greatest power of Kinyan. Rabbi Shimon de Tanya. The case of Rabbi Shimon is that there was a Reuven married Rachel, and Reuven dies. Now Reuven has two brothers. Both of the brothers are over 9, but are not yet bar mitzvah. I'm saying they are over 9 because from Torah law, the act of intimacy is only considered an act when the man is at least 9 years old. It's also important to remember that b'chlal, when it comes to the mitzvahs, until we are bar mitzvah, we have no koyach, we're not obligated to keep mitzvahs, and therefore what we do vis-a-vis a mitzvah doesn't have a real effect. So someone under bar mitzvah cannot do marriage at all, cannot get married, cannot marry a woman. But on the other hand, his act of cohabitation, his act of bia is a bia. So what happened here was that both of the brothers that are between 9 and 13, each one had an act of intimacy, did bia, or they thought they did an act of yibum with the widow. So the Chachamim hold that each one of them, this relationship that they had, this bia, is considered as a mimer. Even though it's a bia, it's an act of yibum, but the act of yibum that is being done by someone under bar mitzvah, it only has the koyach of a mimer. So according to the Chachamim who hold in our Mishnah, yesh mimer la'achar mimer, each brother's mimer has some type of effect. So later when they turn bar mitzvah, she cannot marry either of them because each one did enough connection to disqualify the brother. So she has to get both, a get from both, and chalitza. However, the Rab Shimon says to the Chachamim that no, that in bias rishon bia, that if the act of cohabitation before bar mitzvah, as we said, is just like a mimer, if that takes effect, so there is mimer. So again, here Rab Shimon holds like Rab Gamliel, that that's enough to disqualify the act that the second one did. Bia sheni eina bia, and therefore she can stay with the first brother after he becomes bar mitzvah. And on the other hand, in bias rishon eina bia, if what the first one did is of no significance, then what the second one did is also of no significance. And now the Gemara just talks it out. V'habias ben tesha, having a relation between a man who's under 13 but over 9 is just like a mimer. And we see over here v'ka'amar Rab Shimon says that eina bia, that the second one's bia or mimer is not effective because the first mimer is effective. Ma'ayin is kaina a kinyan chashuv. By Daf Nun Aleph on the base, around 8 lines from the bottom, Ben Azai. Where do we see the opinion of Ben Azai that gives power to mimer, that gives a chashivus to the kinyan of mimer? The Tanya Ben Azai Omer. Ben Azai says he partially agrees with Rab Gamliel in our Mishnah. Yesh mimer achar mimer. The Chachamim are right only when there were 2 brothers and 1 widow. There, each one's mimer had an effect. She needs to get a get from both. Both of them will be asked to marry her relatives. However, ve'ein maimer la'achar maimer b'shtei Yevamos v'yabam echad. So being that at least in this case, Ben Azai holds like Rab Gamliel, why is the maimer of the second not effective? Because the maimer of the first was effective. Because maimer is konyin king and gomer, and the final is Rab Nechemia, the Tanan Rab Nechemia Omer, the Rab Nechemia in our Mishnah, that both when it comes to the act of bia and when it comes to the act of chalitza, regardless when it was done, bein betchila, bein be'emsa, bein besoif, ein achrei klum. Now ask the Gemara 1 second. Bia psula. Let's say he went ahead and he gave a get to the first one. There were 3 wives. He gives a get to the first. Now that he has bia with the second, that bia is called the bia psula. Why is it called the bia psula? Because since he gave a get to the first, he put into play the din of kivin shalei bana shuv le'yivna. So that bia is like a mimer. And nevertheless, Rab Nechemia holds that even if he did bia in middle, bia is only like a mimer. If there's a 3rd wife, and he gives a 3rd wife, let's say mimer, Rab Nechemia holds ein achrei klum. Why is that? Because mimer affects enough of a kinyan that there's nothing left to happen with the 3rd Yevama. So all of these Tanoim share the same opinion, and we will stop over here.